Imagine it's the late 18th century, specifically September 1788. Deep in the foggy, gloomy, and swampy hills of the Balkans, one of Europe's largest military machines is slowly advancing. Under the direct command of Emperor Joseph II of Austria, a colossal army of over 100,000 soldiers is cutting across the landscape toward the Ottoman Empire's border. By the standards of the era, this wasn't just an army. It was a veritable monster of iron, gunpowder, and flesh. We're talking tens of thousands of infantrymen, entire regiments of heavy and light cavalry, endless supply wagon trains that seemed to stretch into infinity, and siege artillery so heavy it made the earth tremble with every step. In the official reports landing in the golden halls of Vienna, Joseph II's force looked like an utterly unstoppable living wall, designed to crush the Ottomans and redraw the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe alongside Catherine the Great's Russia. But Emperor Joseph II wasn't just any ruler. An intellectually restless, deeply ambitious man obsessed with reforms, he didn't want to watch the victory from afar, sitting comfortably in his palace. Joseph II decided to put his boots in the mud and march personally on the front lines, leading his men toward imperial glory. The problem was that while the emperor and his generals stared fascinated at tactical maps and counted heads, they completely ignored a catastrophic structural flaw that was rotting that massive force from the inside out. On paper, 100,000 men looked invincible. In the reality of the encampments, that army was a biological and linguistic ticking time bomb. The Austrian army of 1788 was not a unified national body. Quite the contrary, it was a literal Tower of Babel in constant motion. If you could take a time machine and walk through the camps of the imperial vanguard on that night, what you'd hear wouldn't be the sound of coordinated marches, but a deafening, chaotic symphony of mutually unintelligible languages. Mixed together inside the exact same white uniforms with red collars were German-speaking Austrians, Hungarians speaking Magyar, Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, Bohemians, Slovaks, Romanians from the deep forests of Transylvania, and even Italian contingents from Lombardy. The vast majority of those simple recruits, dragged forcibly from isolated villages to fulfill feudal obligations, couldn't speak a single word of German, which was the official command language of the Habsburg armed forces. Think about that for a second. Men who held the power to kill or die with firearms in their hands were receiving crucial survival orders in a foreign language that sounded like pure noise. In moments of panic, extreme exhaustion, or rapid maneuvering, officers had to scream and gesture hysterically, hoping the order would be translated down the line before it was too late. On a daily basis, in the dusty, muddy camps, this invisible barrier generated constant friction. Regiments from different backgrounds deeply distrusted one another. Even though they all saluted the same double-headed eagle imperial flag, they were, at their core, complete strangers accidentally thrown onto the same side of the trench. As the army trudged heavily and exhaustively through the inhospitable Balkan terrain, surrounded by humidity, boredom, and the constant shadow of an enemy that never seemed to show up where expected, the psychological cohesion of the troops began to crack like glass under pressure. That numerical grandeur of 100,000 men, which felt so safe in Vienna, turned into an awkward, deeply vulnerable military elephant, a fragile structure that, at the slightest hint of confusion in the dead of night, was ready to catastrophically collapse upon itself. If the linguistic and cultural fragmentation was already a silent ticking time bomb inside the imperial camp, the physical and psychological environment where those troops were thrown turned the campaign into a true nightmare of attrition. The war that Emperor Joseph II had declared on the Ottoman Empire in 1787 was not following the glorious script that Vienna's court strategists had planned on their ink-drawn maps. In the Balkans, the reality of modern warfare, or the lack thereof, was terribly brutal. On paper, the Austrian advance looked relentless. In daily practice, the columns of the imperial army were literally sinking into a sea of mud, impassable swamps, and dense primeval forests cutting across the region of present-day Romania. The era's logistical infrastructure was primitively fragile to sustain over 100,000 hungry and thirsty men. Dirt roads turned into deep, muddy trenches after the first autumn rains, swallowing heavy supply wagons, breaking wooden axles, and exhausting draft horses to death. As the march dragged on agonizingly, food convoys began running days, sometimes weeks, behind the vanguard of the troops. Chronic hunger began to stalk the tents. Moldy bread, rotting salted meat, and the murky water of local streams became the daily menu for soldiers who were already marching exhausted. And as if food shortages and harsh terrain weren't enemies enough, a much more relentless and invisible threat began to harvest lives in silence: disease. The worst enemies of any 18th century military camp were not enemy bayonets or cannons, but widespread infections. Dysentery and malaria broke out among the Austrian soldiers with overwhelming violence. Within weeks, field hospital tents overflowed. Strong, healthy men who had marched proudly out of Vienna months earlier now wasted away, thin, feverish, and delirious on beds of rotting straw, vomiting blood and suffering from severe diarrhea. Improvised cemeteries along the march route grew faster than combat casualty lists. The smell of decomposition and disease permeated the humid Balkan forest air, corroding troop morale deeply and irreversibly. But what truly destroyed the mental sanity of the soldiers who managed to stay on their feet was the psychological warfare imposed by the enemy's nature. The Ottoman Empire, skillfully led on the battlefield by Grand Vizier Koça Yusuf Pasha, adopted a highly frustrating and exhausting military strategy for the Austrians. The Turks did not offer an immediate major frontal clash that would allow the Imperials to unleash all their numerical superiority in a clean, pitched battle. Instead, they retreated tactically, burned farmland to leave a scorched earth landscape, poisoned water wells, and used elite irregular cavalry units, the feared akinchas and border troops, to carry out lightning-fast night raids, treacherous ambushes, and quick skirmishes at the edges of the Christian camps. For a young private, a Hungarian peasant, or a Croatian border guard who spent the entire day marching with dozens of pounds of equipment under a suffocating sun or a freezing drizzle, night brought true terror. When the sun went down and dense fog rose from the rivers and swamps, covering the camp in a white, impenetrable shroud, the atmosphere changed radically. No one could sleep soundly. Frontline sentinels had their nerves stretched to the limit, scanning absolute darkness with wide-open eyes, paralyzed by the fear of seeing an Ottoman horseman's silhouette leap from the shadows with a scimitar in hand. In total darkness, an exhausted, paranoid human mind fills all gaps with the worst possible scenario. If a tree branch snapped heavily under the weight of a stray deer in the forest, the sentinel thought it was the silent advance of an enemy squad. If the wind blew hard, shaking the canvas tents, it sounded like the whisper of foreign voices plotting a massacre. This built-up nervous tension day after day transformed the gigantic Austrian army into a cornered, hysterical wild animal caught inside an invisible trap. The entire troop was living at the absolute limit of physical and mental exhaustion. The stage was set. Joseph II's army didn't need a formidable Ottoman force to destroy itself. It already carried gunpowder, paranoia, and a short fuse within. All that was lacking for total disaster was a bottle of cheap liquor and a single shot fired in the dead of night. While the main body of the Imperial army was laboriously dragging itself through the mud and suffering from dysentery in the rear, the spearhead of that immense military machine had to push forward. To map the terrain and ensure there were no unpleasant surprises coming from the Ottoman Empire. This vanguard mission fell to one of the most prestigious, feared, and proud units in all of 18th century Europe, the Hussars. Austrian Hussars were elite light cavalry troops, famous for their daring in open field, their colorful and ornate uniforms, and a legendary reputation for chronic indiscipline, boldness, and a passion for excess off the battlefield. They were rough men, accustomed to danger, who viewed war as both a patriotic duty and a great opportunity for plunder and adventure. On the night of September 21, 1788, a considerable contingent of these hussars received strict orders to cross the Temish River near the small and strategic town of Karánsebes to conduct a deep tactical sweep. The cavalry advanced through the dense darkness, with the horses' hooves muffled by the moisture of the muddy soil. The horsemen scoured hills, valleys, and woods for hours, with their nerves stretched to the limit, expecting at any moment to hear the trot of enemy horses or the glow of Ottoman campfires in the distance. However, as the early morning hours advanced and the perimeter was thoroughly searched, the conclusion became evident. There was absolutely no sign of Turkish troops within a radius of many miles. The enemy seemed to have evaporated into the Balkan fog. For soldiers coming off weeks of extreme psychological tension, hunger, and cold, the absence of the enemy should have been a cause for relief. But under those circumstances, it acted as the perfect trigger for a disastrous relaxation. And it was precisely at this moment of forced calm that fate decided to play its cruelest and most bizarre trick. While patrolling the opposite bank of the river, the Hussars stumbled upon a group of locals, Romani merchants, who had improvised an encampment near a forest clearing. And they weren't selling ordinary provisions, bread or fresh meat. In the wagons of those merchants was something far more valuable and dangerous for a soldier at the end of his rope: giant barrels of schnapps. Balkan frontier schnapps wasn't a refined drink for nobles in the halls of Vienna. It was a rustic, cheap, terribly strong, and craft-distilled liquor, capable of burning the throat of anyone daring enough to swallow it and instantly warming the body against the harsh night wind. For the Austrian cavalry, who were soaked to the bone, exhausted, and mentally drained, the sight of those barrels was like finding the Holy Grail. Military discipline, already staggering under the weight of the campaign, instantly dissolved. The junior officers, instead of enforcing order and reminding the men they were in hostile territory in the middle of a war zone, were the first to surrender to temptation. The patrol was summarily forgotten. Within minutes, the schnapps barrels were purchased, opened, and spread across the improvised riverside camp. Bonfires were lit to beat back the cold, and what was supposed to be a military reconnaissance operation quickly turned into a runaway drinking party. The hussars began to toast effusively to their own luck, laughing about weeks of suffering in the mud, singing songs from their homelands, and emptying mug after mug of that fiery liquor. The cheap alcohol acted with impressive speed in the bloodstream of men whose bodies were already weakened by hunger and a lack of proper sleep. In less than 2 hours, the initial euphoria turned into chaotic, loud drunkenness. Self-control completely vanished. Weapons were carelessly tossed to the ground, horses tied up without the slightest care, and the imperial vanguard's camp converted into a free-for-all zone of disorder. While the hussars drank, laughed, and lost all touch with reality around the bonfire, they had no idea that another element of that colossal army's machinery was moving toward them through the dark. The rest of the troops, the infantry regiments, hungry and equally worn down, were coming right behind them, marching in the same direction, drawn by the smell of smoke and the promise of shelter. The stage was perfectly set. The liquid gold had bought the hussars momentary fun, but the price they would pay for that drinking binge in the dead of night would be paid with the blood of their own comrades. While the hussars were completely surrendering to alcohol-induced stupor and the false sense of security provided by the schnapps barrels, the chaotic machinery of the rest of the Austrian army continued to move through the darkness of the Balkans. Hours after that improvised party began on the banks of the Timiş River, the dead of night was interrupted by the muffled sound of boots sinking into mud and the metallic clinking of military equipment. A considerable contingent of regular infantry, hundreds of exhausted, hungry, and soaked privates, had arrived at that very patrol zone, crossing the river in search of a dry place to camp, rest their sore feet, and get basic supplies. When these infantrymen emerged from the gloom and approached the clearing, they were immediately struck by the strong smell of wood smoke, loud laughter, and above all, the unmistakable aroma of the liquor permeating the air. Upon realizing that the vanguard cavalry was enjoying a private party drenched in liters of alcohol, while the rest of the troops suffered from deprivation in the rear, their immediate reaction was indignation mixed with intense greed. Barrack discipline, already wobbling by invisible threads, completely collapsed. Several infantrymen abandoned their marching formations, broke ranks, and advanced toward the hussar camp with a direct and blunt demand. They wanted their share of the schnapps. However, the hussars, their reflexes already dulled by drink, reasons severely compromised, and taken over by that typical defensive arrogance of those who found a treasure and refused to share it with anyone, refused the request rudely and aggressively. What was supposed to be a simple negotiation between comrades in arms quickly turned sour. The horsemen began pushing the infantrymen, making veiled threats, while the foot soldiers, feeling humiliated and furious at the refusal, responded with curses and hostile gestures. At that exact second, the structural ticking time bomb that had been corroding the Austrian army since the beginning of the campaign detonated with maximum force. If the argument had taken place between men from the same province and speakers of the same language, it is very likely that the tension would have been resolved with a few punches, shoves, universally understood profanities, and a forced separation by junior officers. But that army was a literal Tower of Babel. The hussars, mostly of Hungarian and Germanic origin, shouted orders and insults in their own languages. The infantrymen, coming from remote villages in Croatia, Bohemia, or border regions, replied in their respective Slavic languages or local dialects. Neither side understood what the other was truly yelling. In the heat of anger and under the heavy effect of alcohol, the language barrier turned every unfamiliar word into a deadly threat. The shrill cries cut through by incomprehensible accents, echoing in the absolute darkness of the forest, began to sound to paranoid ears like an explicit declaration of hostility. The human mind, already crushed by weeks of deprivation and the constant fear of Ottoman ambushes, immediately filled the gaps of the unknown with the worst imaginable scenario. In the distorted perception of those drunken men, the fellow comrades right in front of them ceased to be allies and came to be viewed as mortal enemies in disguise. The atmosphere in the camp became unbreathable. Heavy breathing, increasingly violent shoves with gun butts, and a chorus of crossed insults in half a dozen different languages created an atmosphere of absolute electrical frenzy. Then the inevitable happened. In the absolute pitch black of dawn, with no one able to see clearly who was pushing whom, patience completely snapped. A man, taken by a sudden spike of panic and anger, lost all self-control, drew his firearm, and, to command respect or drive away the supposed aggressors, fired a shot into the air. The dry, deafening crack of the musket tore through the silence of the night like the blow of a sharp knife. At that exact moment, the fragile veneer of military civilization completely disintegrated. The sound of the gunshot acted as the apocalyptic signal that the collective paranoia of those exhausted troops had been waiting for in the shadows. It didn't matter that the bullet had been harmlessly launched toward the treetops. For the thousands of men camped nearby who woke up startled by the blast, the conclusion was unanimous and terrifying. The vanguard had been ambushed by the Ottoman army. The single shot fired into the air in the dead of night served as the trigger for a catastrophic chain reaction, instantly destroying whatever remained of sanity and discipline in that military camp. The psychological effect was immediate and absolute. The paranoia accumulated during weeks of exhausting marches, hunger, disease, and psychological terror on the Ottoman frontier erupted all at once, transforming trained men into cornered beasts seized by blind panic. In the absolute darkness of that September dawn, with no one able to see a companion's face or distinguish details of uniforms covered in mud, the language barrier exacted its most bloody price. The second the musket blast echoed through the treetops, someone, whose identity would never be discovered, shouted at the top of their lungs in the gloom, mixing warning terms in different languages. "Turks! The Turks are attacking the camp!" No one stopped for a single second to reason, verify the accuracy of the information, or ask for order confirmation. In the mental ecosystem of a multinational army divided by language barriers, doubt was synonymous with certain death. The infantrymen who had arrived moments before at the camp instantly convinced themselves that the Hussars had been captured, massacred, or were already part of a disguised Ottoman vanguard that had infiltrated the heart of Austrian lines. In turn, the Hussars, their reflexes numbed by liters of schnapps, dizzy and frightened by the sudden sound of gunfire, looked at the mob of infantrymen advancing disorderly in the darkness and concluded, with the same delusional certainty, that they were suffering a treacherous ambush by an enemy army on horseback. The primitive instinct of survival spoke louder than any military regulation. In fractions of a second, the infantry raised their heavy muskets and opened fire en masse, entirely blindly and out of control, against the direction from where the shouts and shadows were coming. On the other side, the Hussars, feeling attacked, reacted with the irrational fury of those who had been surprised in the middle of a party. Several horsemen mounted their animals at a gallop and threw themselves directly against the infantry ranks, trampling tents, sleeping bags, and soldiers trying to get up from the mud. The camp along the banks of the Timish River turned within minutes into a true slaughterhouse of friendly fire. The scene defied all military logic. Men ran in circles in total darkness, firing at point-blank range at any silhouette that moved, stabbing fellow brothers-in-arms with bayonets under the hallucinated conviction that they were fighting against Ottoman invaders. German-speaking Austrian soldiers screamed for help in despair, not understanding why the men next to them attacked them with ferocity. Hungarians and Croats shot at each other in the improvised trenches, fueled by a deafening cacophony of cries of pain, misdirected orders, and the continuous blast of hundreds of firearms spitting lead and gunpowder into the night. As the fratricidal massacre consumed the camp and the number of dead and wounded rapidly skyrocketed, news of the catastrophe began to spread through the command lines in the rear. The situation had escalated to a level so surreal, chaotic, and completely out of control that it demanded direct intervention from the highest echelons of imperial power. And it was precisely at this moment that the very architect of that military campaign decided to step directly into the eye of the hurricane. Emperor Joseph II of Austria, who was closely monitoring the vanguard's operations, was abruptly awakened by the thundering sound of the supposed battle. Seized by the urgency to contain what he believed to be a massive incursion by the Ottoman army, the sovereign hastily mounted his war horse, accompanied by a small group of staff officers and personal guards, and galloped at full speed toward the exact center of the crossfire, determined to impose authority, restore discipline, and organize defense. Approaching the camp wrapped in gunpowder smoke and deafening shouts, the emperor began to scream at the top of his lungs in the dark, using the official command language to order an immediate cessation of hostilities. "Halt! Stop shooting! It's us! Cease fire!" However, in the Dantesque conditions of that dawn, the presence of the empire's maximum sovereign proved to be the final ingredient to complete the burlesque tragedy. The soldiers, completely drunk, exhausted to the extreme, paranoid, and deafened by the deafening noise of gunfire all around, did not recognize the sovereign's voice. To worsen the catastrophic scenario, Joseph II's desperate shouts issued in strong German were interpreted by recruits of other nationalities who didn't understand a single word of the Germanic tongue as commands from enemy officers or bluffs by Ottoman spies trying to trick the troops. The collective reaction of that crazed mass was the worst possible. Instead of laying down their weapons and obeying the imperial order, dozens of soldiers aimed the barrels of their muskets toward the direction where the shouts came from and opened fire directly against the emperor's group. Danger became palpable within milliseconds. Several bullets whistled dangerously close to Joseph II's head, tearing uniforms and shattering riding harnesses. By pure and absolute physical miracle, none of the shots hit the sovereign's body, but the psychological impact of the involuntary betrayal was overwhelming. The emperor's personal horse, terrified by the sudden flash of close-range gunfire and the deafening screams, violently reared its front legs and collapsed backward into the mud, throwing the maximum ruler of Austria with such force that he rolled awkwardly, tumbling headfirst into a ditch of sewage and deep mud. While the imperial army continued to methodically tear itself apart in the dark, the Habsburg emperor, the man who dreamed of redrawing the map of Europe, found himself forced to crawl in the dark mud, hiding crouched at the bottom of a muddy ditch so as not to be summarily executed by the very subjects and soldiers he led. The battle of absolute madness was at its peak, and not even the emperor had managed to escape the blind fury generated by his own army's incompetence. The fratricidal carnage that had consumed the Austrian camp in the darkness of dawn did not diminish in intensity through the merit of any military leadership, nor by any armistice negotiated between sensible officers. The feast of friendly fire only began to gradually wane due to a purely physical and relentless factor: the absolute, crushing exhaustion of the combatants themselves. As the hours passed, the troops' stocks of gunpowder and ammunition for the muskets began to run out. The soldiers' arms weighed tons from constantly reloading their weapons in the dark, and the fatigue accumulated over weeks of forced marches claimed its ultimate price. Slowly, as the first faint rays of sunlight on the morning of September 22, 1788 began to pierce the thick layer of fog covering the swampy banks of the Timish River, the deafening noise of gunfire gave way to a heavy, funereal, and ghostly silence, broken only by the groans of pain from the wounded rotting in the mud and the muffled crackle of embers from the tents still burning. When daylight fully revealed the setting where the imperial vanguard had camped the day before, the vision that greeted the few surviving officers defied every limit of sanity or military logic. There wasn't a single enemy standard, a single Ottoman horseman, or a single Turkish soldier's body across that vast horizon. Instead, what the skeptical and terrified eyes of the officers managed to see was a Dantesque panorama of total destruction brought about by Austria's own hands. The battlefield was literally strewn with hundreds of corpses of Austrian soldiers scattered chaotically among pools of frozen blood and trampled mud. There were Hungarians fallen next to Croats and Germans, struck down by point-blank shots fired by their own comrades in arms just hours before. Campaign tents lay shattered and trampled by horse hooves. Heavy cannons were toppled sideways, and everywhere, mixed with scattered military belongings, dozens of completely empty schnapps barrels lay about, their liquid residues blending with the red earth to symbolize the most stupid and ironic monument to that era's tactical incompetence. The gigantic army of the Austrian Empire, which had left Vienna with the grand promise of driving the infidels from the Balkans and redrawing the map of Eastern Europe, had suffered a humiliating, overwhelming, and catastrophic defeat against itself. while surviving officers began to frantically tally the casualties, which numbered in the hundreds dead and an even higher number of severe wounded. The architect of that imperial catastrophe had to emerge from his humiliation. Emperor Joseph II, who had spent a good part of dawn cowering, mud-covered, and terrified at the bottom of a sewage ditch to avoid being executed by his own soldiers, was finally located by a few personal guard officers who had survived the confusion. Pulled from the ditch in a state of shock, covered head to toe in foul-smelling mud and with his imperial uniform torn and stained, the sovereign faced a moral ruin impossible to disguise. The absolute authority of an absolute monarch relies on the aura of invincibility, competence, and divine order. However, seeing the Emperor of Austria dragging himself out of a muddy ditch after being hunted down with gunfire by his own drunk army instantly destroyed any vestige of military mystique that campaign might still hold. The scandal was covered up in official reports dispatched to Vienna with vague terms and bureaucratic euphemisms about accidental internal conflicts in the vanguard. But the raw, shameful truth leaked quickly through the barracks, racing across Europe at an alarming speed and turning into a laughingstock in the continent's rival courts. And what happened to the dreaded Ottoman Empire army, whose forces were the original pretext for all that titanic mobilization? The Turks didn't need to lift a finger, fire a single arrow, plan a complex ambush, or risk the lives of their own soldiers in the hills of Karánsebes. The Ottoman army, commanded by the Grand Vizier, arrived in the region exactly 2 days after the night of the fratricidal tragedy. When the Turkish vanguard cautiously advanced into the valley, expecting to find the formidable Christian enemy arrayed in battle order, Ottoman scouts encountered a scene straight out of a satirical nightmare. The town and surrounding camps were littered with hundreds of dead Austrian soldiers, groaning in pain in improvised field hospitals, or wandering dazed, weaponless, without supplies, and with their morale totally shattered. The Ottomans simply marched into the area without encountering the slightest hint of resistance. They walked quietly through the debris of the camp, observed the absurd carnage with expressions of utter bewilderment and astonishment, took strategic control of the city, and seized the entire region for free, without spending a single drop of gunpowder. The Austrian army, which had spent an immeasurable fortune and mobilized over 100,000 men to conquer those lands, had self-annihilated with such efficiency that it handed victory on a silver platter to the adversary, without the enemy having to dismount their saddles. The Battle of Karansebes echoed through the centuries not merely as an isolated case of extreme military incompetence, but as the ultimate personification of a dark and comical truth about human nature. Sometimes, an empire's greatest and most relentless enemy isn't the rival nation stationed across the border, but rather the lethal mixture of chronic boredom, poor communication, cheap alcohol, and destructive paranoia that inhabits the minds of armed men left to their own devices in the dark.